The fog clung to the Normandy fields like a burial shroud. Heinrich Voigt sat in the bell tower of St. Martin's Church, his binoculars resting on the stone ledge, and wrote a letter to his sister by candlelight. He was 19 years old. He had been in France for 3 months. He had helped kill more men than he could count, and he had never seen a single one of them die. That was the nature of his work. He was a forward observer for the German artillery, the eyes that found targets and the voice that called down fire. He watched through his binoculars, reported coordinates through his radio, and somewhere behind him, the big guns would speak. Minutes later, distant figures would stop moving. Heinrich would mark the result in his logbook and search for the next target. It was clean. It was professional. It was murder performed at a distance that made it feel like mathematics. 10 miles to the west, in an apple orchard scarred by tank tracks, Sergeant Thomas Riley checked his calculations for the 3rd time. The numbers had to be perfect. 3 days ago, they had not been perfect, and American soldiers had died because of his error. He could still hear the radio traffic, the screaming, the confusion, the silence that followed. The army called it friendly fire. Riley called it what it was. He had killed his own men. Now he commanded an M12 155mm gun motor carriage, one of the most powerful mobile artillery pieces in the American arsenal. His crew had nicknamed it the Long Arm of God. The weapon sat low on a modified tank chassis, its enormous barrel angled toward the sky at 40 degrees. The gun could throw a 95-pound shell over 25,000 yards, more than 14 miles. At that range, German soldiers had less than a minute between the distant thunder and the arrival of death. Most heard nothing at all. The target this morning was a German ammunition depot hidden in a farmhouse complex near the village of La Chapelle. Intelligence reported it supplied 3 panzer divisions. Destroying it could cripple German armor operations for weeks. Riley had plotted the firing solution himself, adjusting for wind, air density, barrel wear, and the rotation of the earth. Long-range artillery was physics made lethal. One wrong variable meant shells falling on the wrong people. His loader, a 20-year-old from Tennessee named Danny Marsh, climbed onto the hull with a shell cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. The brass casing gleamed in the early light. Danny's hands were steady, but his eyes carried the same exhaustion they all shared. Nobody slept well in Normandy. The hedgerows hid too many dangers: German machine gun nests, snipers, tank ambushes. The bocage was a maze designed for killing. Riley gave the order. The crew moved with practiced efficiency. The breach opened. The shell slid home. The powder charge followed. The breach locked. Riley confirmed the elevation and traverse one final time. He thought about the men he was about to kill. He wondered if any of them were writing letters home. He pulled the lanyard. The long arm of God roared. I in the bell tower. Heinrich felt the vibration before he heard the sound. A low rumble rolled across the fields from the west, distant and deep, like thunder from a clear sky. He set down his pen and reached for his binoculars. The flash had come from beyond the horizon, somewhere past the American lines. He began counting: 1, 2, 3, an instinct all German soldiers had learned since the Allied artillery began its relentless bombardment. The shell climbed 3 miles into the morning air, invisible against the pale sky, riding a ballistic arc calculated by a former schoolteacher who used to explain trajectories with chalkboard diagrams. It reached its apex somewhere above the clouds, hung for a heartbeat, then began to fall. Heinrich reached 42 in his count. The farmhouse complex behind the village erupted. The initial explosion was followed by a chain of secondary blasts as the ammunition stores ignited, shells, grenades, fuel drums cooking off in a cascade of fire that painted the fog orange. The shock wave shattered windows in the church. Heinrich was thrown from his chair. When he pulled himself up, half of La Chapelle was burning. He stared at the destruction through his cracked binoculars. The depot was gone. Weeks of supplies, erased in seconds. And the gun that had done this was so far away that Heinrich could not even see the smoke from its firing. He understood then what the American artillery meant. There was no front line anymore. There was no safe distance. The enemy could reach out from beyond the horizon and touch anything, anyone, anywhere, his radio crackled. His commanding officer's voice was sharp with fear disguised as anger. "Find that gun. Find it before it finds us." Heinrich looked west, toward the invisible enemy, and began to plan. He did not know that 10 miles away, a man named Thomas Riley was already calculating his next shot. He did not know that their paths would cross in ways neither could imagine. He knew only that the thunder beyond the horizon had made him a target, and targets in this war did not survive for long, that he had 45 seconds to change that. Or less. 3 days after the depot burned, Heinrich Voigt walked through a landscape of craters. The American shells had transformed the Norman countryside into something from a nightmare, fields churned into mud, farmhouses reduced to scattered stones, trees stripped bare and splintered like broken bones. Each crater told a story. Heinrich read them like a hunter reading tracks that he led a reconnaissance team of 4 men, all that could be spared from a regiment bleeding soldiers faster than Berlin could replace them. Their mission was simple and nearly impossible: find the American gun that was systematically destroying every German position within its range. 3 command posts had been hit in 3 days. A tank repair depot had vanished. An officer's mess had become a mass grave. The gun moved after every shot, hiding somewhere in the endless bocage, and no one could find it. Heinrich studied the craters with the analytical eye his instructors had praised. Shell fragments revealed caliber. Crater depth indicated trajectory. Trajectory suggested distance. He collected data the way a scientist collects evidence, building a picture of his invisible enemy. The shells were 155mm, American heavy artillery. The angles pointed west, toward the hedgerow country near St. Lo. The gun was mobile, probably mounted on a tank chassis. He had heard rumors of such weapons. The Americans called them gun motor carriages. 10 miles away, Sergeant Riley was learning to live like a hunted animal. The M12 was powerful but fragile. Its open-topped fighting compartment offered no protection from air attack. Its thin armor would not stop a Panzerfaust at close range. Its slow reload time, 2 minutes between shots, made it vulnerable during engagements. Survival meant constant movement, careful concealment, and paranoid attention to every detail. His crew had developed routines born from fear. They moved only at night, the M12's engine muffled by the surrounding hedgerows. They hid under camouflage nets during the day, the massive gun barrel covered with branches and netting. They never fired from the same position twice. They never stayed anywhere longer than necessary. Riley had become a ghost, commanding a weapon that killed from beyond sight, and ghosts did not survive by being careless, but command kept demanding fire missions. Another target had been identified, a German command post coordinating panzer movements near the Weyer River. High-value target. Essential mission. Riley plotted the solution and felt the familiar weight of responsibility. Every shell he fired was a beacon revealing his position. Every shot brought the enemy closer. Heinrich found the first real clue near an abandoned orchard. American supply crates, carelessly discarded. Tire tracks too wide for normal vehicles. Broken branches at a height suggesting something large had pushed through. He followed the trail through a gap in the hedgerow and found what he was looking for, a firing position. The ground was scorched in a distinctive pattern. Brass shell casings gleamed in the dirt. The Americans had been here, perhaps 12 hours ago. He photographed the position, measured the scorch marks, calculated the probable trajectory of the departed gun. His map was becoming a web of lines and circles, narrowing the search area with each discovery. The enemy was close now. 8 miles, perhaps less. Close enough to reach on foot. Riley fired at dawn. The long arm of God bellowed, sending another shell arcing across the morning sky toward the German command post. The target was 18 miles away, near the maximum effective range. He had adjusted for everything, triple-checked every calculation. The shell would fly for over a minute before impact. Heinrich heard the thunder from 4 miles away. This time, he was ready. He marked the compass bearing, noted the time, triangulated with his previous observations. The gun was northwest of his position, somewhere in a sector of dense hedgerows and scattered farms. He radioed for support, Luftwaffe aircraft, counter-battery fire, anything that could strike the position before the Americans moved again. The response was silence. No aircraft available. No artillery in range. German resources were stretched across a crumbling front, and a single enemy gun was not a priority. Heinrich understood. He would receive no help. If the gun was to be stopped, he would have to stop it himself. He gathered his team and explained the situation. The target was approximately 5 miles away. They could reach it by nightfall if they moved quickly. 4 men against an American artillery crew, probably 6 soldiers with rifles, perhaps a machine gun for local defense. Poor odds, but not impossible. Surprise could make the difference. His men exchanged glances. They knew the risks. They also knew what would happen if the gun kept firing. One by one, they nodded. Heinrich checked his rifle. He had never killed a man face to face. He had only ever killed from a distance, calling in coordinates and watching explosions through binoculars. Tonight would be different. Tonight, he would look into the eyes of his enemy. He hoped he would have the courage to pull the trigger. The team moved out, for shadows slipping through the hedgerows toward a ghost and its terrible weapon. Behind them, smoke still rose from the command post that no longer existed. 45 seconds, Heinrich thought. That was how long the enemy's shells took to arrive. He would need to be faster. Moonlight turned the forest clearing into a silver photograph. Sergeant Riley sat on the hull of the Long Arm of God, smoking a cigarette cupped in his palm to hide the glow, and listened to the silence between the distant guns. Somewhere to the east, American and German artillery traded fire in a conversation of explosions. Here, in this hidden pocket of woods, there was only the breathing of sleeping men and the whisper of wind through the leaves. He could not sleep. The faces kept him awake, not the faces of enemies he had killed, because he had never seen those, but the faces of the American soldiers his miscalculation had destroyed. He remembered their names from the casualty report. Private Williams. Corporal Hensley. Sergeant O'Brien. 3 men turned to fragments by a shell he had aimed wrong. The army had called it an acceptable margin of error. Riley called it 3 letters he would never be able to write. Danny Marsh stirred in his blanket nearby. The young loader had aged years in weeks. The boy who had arrived in Normandy with dreams of heroism now flinched at sudden noises and slept with his rifle across his chest. War had stripped away his innocence with surgical precision, leaving something harder and sadder in its place. At the edge of the clearing, their sentry faced the wrong direction. Heinrich Voigt lay in the undergrowth 50 meters away, his heart pounding against the cold earth. He had been crawling for 20 minutes, moving inches at a time, freezing at every sound. His 3 companions waited 200 meters back. They would provide covering fire if the attack went wrong. If it went right, they would not be needed. He could see the M12 clearly now. The massive weapon crouched in the moonlight like a prehistoric beast, its long barrel pointed skyward at a steep angle. The chassis was a modified M3 tank hull, open-top to accommodate the enormous gun. He counted 5 Americans, 4 sleeping, 1 standing guard. Their rifles were stacked nearby, within reach but not in hand. Heinrich held 2 stick grenades, German Model 24s with their distinctive long handles designed for throwing distance. 1 for the gun, 1 for the crew. At this range, he could not miss. The explosions would kill most of them instantly. The survivors would be easy targets. He pulled the pin on the first grenade. The fuse began its 5-second countdown, then Danny spoke in his sleep. The words were English, mumbled and soft, but Heinrich understood enough. Mother. Miss you. The young American soldier was dreaming of home, of a woman who waited for letters, of a kitchen that smelled like bread and safety. His face, visible in the moonlight, looked impossibly young. He could not have been older than Heinrich himself. Heinrich's hand trembled. The grenade felt heavy, wrong, different from calling in coordinates through a radio. This was not mathematics. This was murder with a face that he saw his sister's eyes. He saw the letter he had been writing in the bell tower. He saw all the distant explosions he had caused, and for the first time, he imagined the men inside them, boys like Danny, dreaming of mothers they would never see again. His arm would not throw. His mind screamed commands, but his body refused to obey. A branch snapped beneath his knee. The sound cut through the silence like a rifle shot. The sentry spun. Their eyes met across 30 meters of moonlit forest, 2 young men, 2 enemies, 2 human beings trapped in a moment that would define everything that followed. The sentry shouted. The sleeping Americans scrambled for weapons. Heinrich's frozen hand finally moved, hurling the grenade not at the crew but wide, into the trees, where it exploded uselessly against an oak trunk. Everything happened at once. Riley rolled off the hull and grabbed his carbine. Danny came up firing blind, bullets snapping through leaves. Heinrich's second grenade flew toward the M12 but struck a branch and deflected, landing short, the explosion showering the gun with dirt but causing no damage. Heinrich ran. He had failed. The mission was over. Now he had only survival. That he made it 10 steps before Riley tackled him from behind. They crashed into the undergrowth, fighting with fists and elbows and knees. Heinrich was younger and desperate. Riley was stronger and trained. They rolled through mud and leaves, each trying to kill the other, until Danny arrived with a shovel. The flat blade caught Heinrich across the temple. The world went white, then black. When he woke, his hands were tied. He sat against the cold metal tracks of the long arm of God, the weapon he had come to destroy. Dawn was breaking through the trees. Blood dripped from a cut above his eye. Sergeant Riley stood over him, carbine in hand, face unreadable. Heinrich looked up at the American who should have been his victim and waited for the bullet that would end everything. He had failed his mission. He had failed his country. He had hesitated when hesitation meant death, but he had not thrown the grenade at a sleeping boy who dreamed of his mother. He wondered if that mattered. He wondered if mercy existed in war. He wondered if he would live long enough to find out. Riley did not fire. Instead, he asked a question. Why didn't you throw sooner? Heinrich had no answer. Or perhaps the answer was too complicated for words. The morning light made the blood on Heinrich's face look almost black. He sat against the tracks of the M12, hands bound with radio wire, watching the Americans argue about whether to kill him. He understood enough English to follow the debate. The young one, Danny, wanted him dead. The others were uncertain. The sergeant, Riley, said nothing. Heinrich did not blame them for their anger. He had tried to murder them in their sleep. In their position, he would have wanted the same revenge. War made executioners of ordinary men. He had learned that truth while calling in artillery strikes on distant villages. Now he was learning it from the other side. Riley crouched in front of him and offered a canteen. Heinrich drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was the finest thing he had ever swallowed. Small mercies meant everything when death was minutes away. You could have killed Danny, Riley said quietly. He was closest. Your first grenade would have gotten him for sure. Why did you throw wide? Heinrich looked at the young American who had dreamed of his mother. Danny glared back with hatred that came from fear, the kind of hatred that needed an enemy to survive. Heinrich understood that too. He had felt it himself, in the bell tower, watching distant explosions and pretending the dead were numbers instead of people. He was sleeping, Heinrich said. His English was rough but functional. He was talking about his mother. Riley studied him for a long moment. Something shifted in the American's expression, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. They were the same, Heinrich realized. 2 men who killed from distances that made murder feel like mathematics. 2 men who had discovered that the distance was a lie. The crew's radioman approached with news. Transport for prisoners would not arrive for at least 6 hours. The unit had orders to displace immediately. Intelligence reported German patrols in the area. They could not wait. They could not take a prisoner with them. The M12 was too cramped, too vulnerable. Danny's solution was simple. A bullet, a shallow grave, and silence. The German had tried to kill them. Justice demanded reciprocity. Riley looked at Heinrich. He thought about the shells he had fired, the men he had killed, the comfortable distance that separated him from the consequences of his calculations. He thought about Private Williams, Corporal Hensley, Sergeant O'Brien, Americans who had died because his mathematics had been wrong. He had killed more of his own countrymen than this German soldier had killed of anyone. No, Riley said that he cut Heinrich's bonds and replaced them with looser rope, tight enough to restrain but loose enough that a determined man could eventually work free. He bandaged the cut on Heinrich's head with supplies from the medical kit. He gave him a full canteen and a chocolate bar from his own rations, then he tied Heinrich to a tree at the edge of the clearing, in a position that would be visible to the military police patrols that swept the area every few hours. The German would be found. He would be taken prisoner. He would survive. Danny watched in disbelief. He tried to kill us. So did I, Riley said. Every time I pull that lanyard. The only difference is distance. He climbed onto the M12 and started the engine. The great gun rumbled to life, tracks churning the soft earth. Heinrich watched from his tree as the weapon that had brought him here prepared to leave. Riley paused before giving the order to move out. He looked back at the German prisoner, the boy who had crawled through the night to kill them, the boy who had hesitated when hesitation meant failure, the boy who had seen humanity in an enemy's dream and could not bring himself to destroy it. 45 seconds, Riley said. That's how long my shells take to reach their targets. You had longer than that. You could have killed us all. Heinrich met his eyes. So could you. Right now. You still can. Riley nodded slowly. Yeah. I could. He gave the order. The M12 rolled forward, pushing through the undergrowth toward its next firing position. Heinrich watched until the sound of its engine faded into the morning forest. Then he began working on his ropes that he was found 4 hours later by an American patrol, exactly as Riley had planned. He spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in England, reading books and learning better English and writing letters to his sister that actually reached her. He never fired another weapon. He never called in another artillery strike. The war ended without him, and he was grateful. 40 years later, in the autumn of 1984, an elderly Heinrich Voigt returned to Normandy. The bell tower of St. Martin's had been rebuilt. The craters had become farmland again. The hedgerows remained, but now they sheltered cattle instead of killers. That he stood where the clearing had been, though time and growth had erased all traces of that night. He thought about a young American sergeant who had chosen mercy when hatred would have been easier. He had never learned the man's name. He had never tried to find him. Some distances, he understood now, were not meant to be crossed. Some debts were repaid simply by living well, by raising children, by refusing to teach them hatred. That he looked west, toward where the long arm of God had hidden among the apple trees, and counted to 45, then he went home.